As much as we'd like to, knowing why head pain or the headache, or even much worse, chronic headaches with migraines, knowing why they occur, we really can't say exactly what the cause is. At this point, many of these conditions are still idiopathic, and that simply means we don't know the answer, we don't know the cause, and so it needs to be better researched. And there are many things like this in the body currently. We're working on it still, of course. Many people are working on it. One of the things we can do, of course, is know our triggers, things that might cause them or worsen them. And oftentimes it comes down to a few simple key elements that you yourself can cause. Overexertion, doing too much. We want to avoid that. Certain dietary factors and certain environmental factors. Identifying these things is super important. It makes it so much easier to avoid the severity of head pain, headache, chronic headaches, and migraine. But that being said, there are other outside influences that can change the way things they work, because the body is not just a bag of chemicals. Of course, there's structural elements to it, and there are nervous or neural elements that we should pay attention to at the same time. These all work together to make one singular, very important structure. So when we're looking at them, generally, I will say very generally, there's three major potentials that we like to look at to really understand what's going on, what can influence the head and make these headaches more severe than they should be or could be. So let's look at the neuromechanical influences. The first one we're going to talk about is the jaw clenching of the jaw. I think we've all heard of this. Now, what you have to know is it can exert, the jaw, human jaw and its muscles, of course, can exert over 200 pounds of pressure in some cases. For a lot of people, it's a lot less, but this is very true of a lot of people. They are capable of exerting an incredible amount of force on that jaw. So some of the muscles, for instance, we'll start with just the temporalis muscle, which looks approximately like this, fibered like so. It does the movement of the jaw to make it close. Now, any of these muscles, the muscles of mastication is their technical general name, any of these muscles are under your control, sort of. It's a little bit like breathing because you can choose when they move, but the resting tension is actually relatively high. The muscles in general, and we'll just throw in the masseter muscle as well, and then deeper on the inside, you wouldn't necessarily see these two. There would be two of them. They are the pterygoid muscles, and they basically point, they're on the inside, of course, but they point in that way. They're pointed in that way, and they'll attach to a bone called the sphenoid deep inside the skull. Each of these hold the jaw from falling, so they have a certain amount of tension basically at all times. If there's a lot of tension, consider how much force, or if they're pressing excessively, consider that you are teeth on teeth here. This is the teeth of the mandible below, what we call the jaw, the maxilla, really one of the face bones above, and that one's outlined like that. I could do better than that. There we go. Blue, that'll do. Maxilla above. And this, if it presses too hard up, basically carries through from mandible, jaw, to maxilla, to skull. So we can put pressure on the skull from the jaw upward. And this is considerably important in a considerable amount of pressure that we can actually exert on the skull. And it might be involuntary, because remember, it's only partial control that we have over this. It will be tensing up a certain amount at all times to keep from going slack. Now, for sure, that is one way. On the other hand, even when that jaw is closed and held closed properly, I would say it's more the temporalis and the pterygoid muscles here. They have the capacity, both of these things, if the jaw should be in a different position or offset or not firing right, it has the capacity to pull on the skull. So now we can look at it at the temporal bone. We can look at it as a sphenoid bone on the inside, the jaw pulling through the muscles into the skull, creating different changes in tension on the skull itself. And so that can be a big influencer on the sensation of the skull. And if there was existing pain already there, it could potentially enhance that pain. Now, another big deal is muzzle pull or the jaw position or the jaw's pressure on the face and therefore eventually the skull. Is it even? Is it side shifted left or right? When we're uneven, and this is almost always the case because everybody has a favorite side of chewing unless you specifically train yourself not to. If you have a favorite position of the jaw, then you're going to notice that it's not balanced from left to right. We've got more pressure on one side, and this tends to wear out or at least irritate areas more than others. And this can be an influence on the pain experienced in the head. What you'll find too is a lot of the time the tension in the jaw, the raising motor tone going up and up and up, is a stress-related factor, which is the theme for the day. So when we get more stressed out, you'll find that your jaw tension increases accordingly. And this is basically a more primitive reflex, and it's wired into our defense mechanisms, our fight or flight mode. That's going to come up again. Okay, next point we're going to make is the neck tension. So the tension of the neck also affects the head, and it is caused by general neck tension in the very same way that the jaw tension was caused, can be increased by stress. So for instance, the trapezius muscle, which wouldn't look exactly like that, but looks, approximately there to there, the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which goes around like that. All of these things, they're wired into a system that rights and balances the head, but they're also tied into our stress systems. So it tends to be, as we get stressed out, these muscles shorten, lifting up, so they actually pull this way and this way. They'll pull the head forward too, but in any case, ultimately the shoulders lift up. A stressed out person has raised high shoulders, and it's partially because our neck muscles are tied into our stress system. And so looking at it in the same way, if on the other hand you just flip that on its head, pun intended, if you flip that on its head, if you restricted the scapula motion, maybe the clavicle too over here, maybe the weight of the arm was pulling funny on it, it's humorous, it could then reverse the direction of pull, and now instead of pulling on the arm to raise it or the shoulder to raise it, it actually starts pulling on multiple points in the skull. So this can work in both directions. And when you start pulling on the skull is very durable. Don't get me wrong, it's a very strong thing, but it does have joints within it. It has little sutures here, and those sutures are meant to withstand a great deal of pressure for sure, but they're not invincible, and they are sensitive to shape changes. They want really to avoid excessive shape changes, because there is a very important brain underneath all this that could potentially be damaged, and the body is very guarding against that, because it's kind of the last thing you can damage before you can't damage anything else. So another thing though, there is a dense network of muscles under all of this, underneath the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. There's scalene muscles, for instance, going to that first rib. Maybe you've heard of these. And there's a big old platysma. I'm not going to keep it in here, but it's going like, somewhere around here. Just there. Big. Love that muscle. Really cool muscle. But let's leave it out just so we can all see. And then you're going to have a lot of deeper muscles. I left these out on purpose just so we could all understand what's happening. Deeper muscles that go neck to the deep points of the skull. And that might be semispinalis, spinalis, longissimus, multifidus, if they're left over there. Not everybody has them all the way up to the skull, but you've got some deeper muscles. And what you'll also find is that wrapping around all these muscles very, very intricately in a very neat pattern, you've got lots of veins, superficial veins and deeper veins. So it might be the jugular, going through the well-named jugular foramen, or it could be some of the superficial venous networks that we see throughout really everything in the body. But at the same time, we have got some lymphatic networks, and that's nodes and it's vessels, and they tend to run essentially the same pathways. They're coming back. They're draining the head and the neck, the scalp. They'll help assist with clearance of the fluid through this region. All of them will, the veins and the lymphatics, but they're intricately woven into the neck muscles. And what it's supposed to be is, like everywhere else in the body, the neck muscles on and off tension, the change in position of the head, is supposed to help move fluid through. It's supposed to move fluid out of the skull. So this fluid, what we call the CSF right here, it actually does drain out through eventually what becomes the venous system, and the dural venous sinuses to the sigmoid sinus, essentially out of the skull becoming the jugular. And there's been found now, we know that there are actually lymphatic-like structures within the brain. It's not completely understood, but there's actually a lymph clearance system in the brain, or one similar enough. So we know that clearing the fluid out of this area effectively does have to travel down and through the neck. If it doesn't go effectively down and through the neck, we can see a little bit of a backup in the system. Now, this is not a dangerous backup by any means. The skull is completely safe. The brain will not be damaged, is not under threat, but understand that this tissue is incredibly sensitive to pressure changes. It doesn't really want any pressure changes, just like the sutures of the skull don't really want to move excessively, but we don't want a lot of pressure changes inside the brain because that can be potentially damaging. This amount of pressure, the pressure created by muscular tension, changing muscular tension through the neck, is by no means dangerous. It's by no means lethal, but at the same time, the body doesn't like it. It doesn't prefer it. And given enough time, it can actually increase the sensation of pain through the neck and into the head as well. And that's something we have to keep in mind, of course. So, last point, and there could be more points, but the last point we're going to make is the higher level brain center constriction. So this brain has a lot of different parts, and most of the body is actually managed by this area in here. That's the brainstem and what we might call the limbic system, the cerebellum, forgot that. That's a great guy right there. Anyways, cerebellum, inclusive. Don't want anyone yell at me on the internet, but we've got lots of areas of the brain, there we go, that control most of our body. We'll call those lower centers just for this sake. And then what we call conscious thought is actually just a little bit on the top. This picture doesn't do it justice. It seems like it's a lot thicker than it is, but it's a relatively thin layer that kind of covers the outside. And that's where we do our conscious reasoning and thinking. Higher level thought happens there. And what happens, incidentally, when we get stressed, again, stress is the theme, those blood vessels that come all the way up from down here, the blood vessels that go in to supply the brain through the carotid, intracarotid, for instance, that come out, and they're vertebral, forgot the vertebral, can't forget that. They come up and they'll form, the basilar artery, and then eventually the circle of Willis, and they'll shoot off branches like so, give or take, Don't quote me on that. But they'll shoot off a few branches. And what we find is they'll go all over the place, of course. They'll supply all areas of the brain. And what's been found is that under stressful situations, we actually start to constrict the vessels of the higher centers of the brain. So you're stressed out. Your body, regardless if it's true or not, believes itself to be being chased. And so it reduces just slightly, it's a very slight constriction, reduces the blood flow to the higher center of the brain, and that means the lower centers of the brain, the stuff that makes your body move, the stuff that makes it run away better, and the stuff that makes your organs function to the best of their ability, and will also kind of turn off like unnecessary elements of digestion. It shuts down the immune system even a little bit. That's part of the function of cortisol, but it will limit the blood flow to the higher centers of the brain, increase blood flow to the lower centers of the brain, and basically this means the blood flow during that time is what we call suboptimal. It's not quite right. Now, the problem is this is actually supposed to be a very temporary measure. This is a huge deal in the stress response. This is the entire field of research is basically going into this, that sympathetic vagal relationship, stress and energy, all that. Anyways, basically what's the important element is that stress is supposed to be temporary, It does its job. It shuts down the blood flow to the less essential areas, increases it to the more lower areas. It increases it, say, to the the heart down here and lungs, cuts it to the digestive system. But this is for a short period of time. That was the intention, of course. But because we stay in chronic states of stress very commonly now, the issue with that is that we are operating for larger periods of time than we care to admit, with, again, suboptimal blood flow to the higher centers of the brain. And this little bit of constriction, not only can it cloud your judgment slightly, because these are thought and reasoning centers of the brain, it can also make you a little more prone to experiencing pain in that head area. So these are the three potentials that we're very concerned with. And so for that reason, if you're someone who happens to have chronic headaches, head pain in general, neck pain in general, even migraines, first and foremost, have a doctor on your team, someone who can help you through that. The medical side is incredibly important in safeguarding you from dangerous things. But you may also consider, even just to reduce the amount of pain you're experiencing, you can practice relaxing your jaw. You can practice relaxing your shoulders and even parts of your neck, because they all feed into that cranium. They all feed into that face and change the way these things work and change the tension on them and the ability to perceive pain. And you really do have to practice it. That is a huge part of it, because it is voluntary, but not entirely voluntary. So you have to learn to relax, and that takes time and experience. You may also notice you need to limit stressors, and that's not always a possibility, of course. You can't get rid of all of your family members. And of course, talking to someone is a good step forward too. The talk-based therapies sometimes need to be done, because remember, these are all stress things that can influence the head that we've talked about. So talking to someone can be very valuable too. Manual therapy is good as well, and whether that's physical-based therapies, exercise, as is physiotherapy, could be osteopathy, could be chiropractic, could be massage. Whatever helps you relax, whatever helps you feel better, can honestly improve these things. Hopefully that was informative. Hopefully that made sense. This has been Elge from Simple Lines Anatomy.